Welcome, everyone, back to the second session of the 2022 State of the Sound Symposium. Scientists often use the term ecological services to explain how a healthy natural environment creates a healthy human environment. In Port Royal Sound, oysters, crustaceans, and marine fish provide important economic benefits to our local communities, while also serving as indicators of the Sound's health. The talks in the second session provide information on these important groups of marine life. To kick off this section, Dr. Peter Kingsley-Smith, shellfish scientist at Marine Resources Division of South Carolina DNR, will give us a talk about the importance of Port Royal Sound to the statewide Oyster Reef landscape. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Chris. Well, good morning, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today, and particularly thanks to Chris Marsh for spearheading this effort. My presentation this morning will focus on highlighting the importance of oysters in the Port Royal Sound in terms of their contributions to our understanding of oyster population demographics and to our state-managed fisheries. I'd also like to take a moment here to thank my co-authors here at the DNR, both in the Shellfish Research section, Gary Sundin, Graham Wagner, and Greg Rothman, as well as from our Shellfish Management section, Ben Dyer. Doesn't seem to be advancing. All right, thank you. Slight technical hitch. I think we're back in business. So within South Carolina, 95% of our oyster reefs occur as fringing or patch reefs, such as those seen here. And these intertidal oyster reefs are a dominant and highly visible feature of the South Carolina estuarine landscape. From a global perspective, such dense assemblages of bivalves that form reefs, in the case of oysters, or beds, in the case of mussels and clams, are broadly recognized for their ability to support ecosystem services. And these ecosystem services can broadly be defined as any benefits the wildlife or ecosystems provide to people. These services have been grouped into 4 categories, as illustrated in this graphic. This illustration was created by Scotland's nature agency, NatureScot, and while designed for the benefits of the seas, it can be readily applied to other marine and estuarine systems. In this illustration, ecosystem services are categorized into 4 categories, namely provisioning, cultural, maintaining, and supporting. In the case of oysters in South Carolina, we can think of the following examples of these categories of ecosystem services. For provisioning, we might think about the provision of shellfish stocks that support recreational and commercial fisheries. In terms of cultural significance, we might think of these iconic low country oyster roasts. In terms of their ability to support the habitat needs of a diversity of other species, we might think about species like American oyster catchers, a large proportion of which overwinter along the South Carolina coast. And finally, for maintaining, we might think about oyster reefs' ability to maintain our estuarine salt marshes through their ability to protect shorelines from wave energies derived from both storm events and boat weeks, such as seen here along the ICW. Given the significance of these ecosystem services, there has long been an interest in mapping the distribution of oysters across our state. And their exposure twice a day at low tide is conducive to direct visual assessments of their distribution. The first effort to map oysters in South Carolina occurred in 1890 and 1891 as part of something called the John D. Battle Survey. And this was conducted aboard the US Fishhawk, a commercial fisheries vessel, which was perhaps not the most ideal choice of vessel for navigating tidal creeks in South Carolina, limiting the access of this survey to certain areas where oysters were known to occur. This was followed by significant on-the-ground-based efforts in 1980s and 1990s, using large-scale maps and hand annotations of the distribution of oyster reefs, viewed at low tide. With the advancement of technology in the early 2000s, the entire state of South Carolina was flown to capture quarter-meter high-resolution imagery. This was followed by using GIS techniques to both automatically identify as well as hand digitize the distribution of oyster reefs, such as those shown in red in this figure. And then since 2018, which we may refer to as the age of the UAV or the unoccupied aerial vehicle, we've been using this technique to generate high quality products, such as an example shown here. This is UAV collected imagery with digitized oyster reefs shown in red. And for those of you wondering whereabouts on the May River this is, there's a slight inset here. This is in the upper headwater regions of the May River, just west of the May River Golf Course. And to really convince you that the quality of these UAV products is highly conducive to identifying and mapping oyster reefs, we can zoom in on a particular area of this map shown here in the next slide and see that we can see individual clusters of oysters at really close range. The culmination of many of these mapping efforts has generated a prize statewide distribution map of oysters across our state, which many other partners have made use of over the years and is available online at this address. So to orient you to our map, our study area of interest today is highlighted here in this blue polygon, which should be now familiar to many of you. Areas lacking aerial imagery are shown in orange, basically data poor areas, and then areas mapped and verified as supporting oyster reefs, again shown in red. So really the first take-home message here is, based on these mapping efforts over multiple decades, we know that there are more than 5,000 areas of intertidal oyster reefs statewide, and more than 45% of these occur within the Port Royal Sound area. Despite the abundance of oysters in our state, oyster reefs as a habitat are recognized as being imperiled on a global stage, leading to restoration programs not only in states across the United States, but also countries across the world. This report, called Shellfish Reefs at Risk, was released in 2009 by the Nature Conservancy and estimated that 85% of oyster reefs globally had been lost. And while this number does not apply to South Carolina specifically, this report did serve to increase attention on the value of restoration, even on a local scale. Oyster reef restoration in South Carolina relies on the natural reproductive life cycle of the oysters shown here. Oysters are described as being gregarious settlers. What that means is that larval oysters preferentially settle on the shells of previous generations of their own species. This is how three-dimensional, multi-generational reefs are created. In South Carolina, estuaries are referred to as being substrate limited, such that if we provide suitable substrate, either in the form of natural oyster shells or alternative materials on which oysters like to settle, new reefs can be formed entirely as a result of natural reproduction. Over the last 2 decades at the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, this substrate has taken many forms, from natural oyster reefs, either in bagged or loose form, shown in the top 2 panels, to a variety of wire mesh-based approaches originating from the repurposing of abandoned derelict crab traps, shown bottom right, to perhaps our most robust substrate, that of oyster castles, which have performed well in high wave energy environments, such as along the intracoastal waterway, seen here. Recognizing the success of wire-based reef building structures, researchers at the DNR's Shellfish Research section have pioneered the design, construction, deployment, and evaluation of prefabricated manufactured wire reefs, or MWRs, such as those seen here at the Port Royal Sound Maritime Center along the bank of the Chichessie River. This technique was subsequently adopted by DNR's SCORE program, a community-based restoration program, for which the use of large groups of volunteers to deploy bagged shell during the pandemic became particularly problematic. These are those same MWRs approximately 5 years later, showing high levels of recruitment and vertical structure of the reef, and even signs of new marsh grass growing behind the reef. Understanding temporal and spatial patterns of oysters across our state and on a regional basis can be useful for deciding where to direct restoration efforts. This background information can also be put to use to determine the consequences of impacts on both local and large scales in terms of disturbances such as extreme weather events. This rationale led in 2015 to the development of something called SCODA, the South Carolina Oyster Demographics Assessment Program. This is an annual survey conducted in the fall and the winter that samples wild intertidal oyster reefs across our state. This series of index stations was chosen to incorporate diverse criteria such as areas of historical fisheries importance, sites that were index stations for previous research such as on disease studies, but also to capture variability in environmental conditions. In a given year, the sampling program visits 35 to 37 sites, such as those shown in black here, 9 of which occur in the Port Royal Sound area. Going back to some of our earlier discussions on watersheds, we can overlay the watersheds on the state level and then group some of these watersheds into larger regional areas. For the purposes of our future studies to look at regional differences in oyster characteristics, we're really dealing with these 4 regions: the northern region, what we refer to as the Charleston region, the St. Helena region, and the Port Royal Sound region. This next illustration is just a blow-up of that previous slide showing that the Port Royal Sound and the St. Helena Sound have specific sampling locations as part of this program. And these are the 9 sites that I previously mentioned, with Whale Branch in the north down to the Calabogie Sound in the south. Researchers visiting each of these sites will collect triplicate quadrat samples of wild intertidal oyster reefs at low tide, and these are then processed back in the lab to generate numbers and sizes of both live and dead oysters. It's worth pointing out that the first year that we conducted this assessment was something of an abnormal year, following the historic rain event that occurred in the first week of October of 2015, which brought more than 20 inches of rain to some parts of the state. This caused significant reductions in salinity in many watersheds and consequent oyster die-offs that were seen reflected in some of our SCODA data. So what I'd like to do now is walk you through just an example of one data set from this SCODA survey. So here I'm going to show you a time series of the population structure of live oysters for a station in the Broad River. To orient you to these panels, we have the sizes of individual live oysters on the x-axis, ranging from 0 to 150 millimeters in shell height, and then the frequency or the count of numbers of that oyster class on the y-axis. So again, this is the first survey conducted in the fall or the winter, following on from that historic rain event. And as we'll see by comparing future panels, this particular size frequency distribution is characterized by an absence of large oysters and fairly low levels of small oysters. So as we track this through time, again, if we look at the next season, or the next year rather, in 2016, 2017, similar to 2015, 2016. But then what's encouraging, and as I mentioned, both of these years are characterized by the absence of large oysters being greater than 3 inches approximately in size. And as I mentioned, this second year is reflective of low levels of recruitment as related back to the absence of adult reproductively capable oysters in the previous year. What's encouraging, however, is that by 2017, 2018, we see recovery in the form of a strong year class of young of the year oysters less than 1 inch in size. If we look ahead to the next 2 seasons of sampling, again, we see moderate levels of recruitment characterized by these smaller individuals. What we really start to see is the return of these larger adult oysters of greater than 3 inches in size. And so this really, just at this one site, tells the story of the recovery of the oyster population following a significant environmental perturbation. Combining data across multiple years can then allow us to visualize spatial patterns of mortality across these 4 study regions, delineated by the water boundaries that I showed you in the previous slides. And so as a summary, actually to back up to orient you these slides, so again we have these 4 sampling regions, and then we have a series of individual dots which show the percent mortality. So that is the percentage of oysters that were sampled that were dead upon processing. And the sizes of these dots is scaled relative to the level of mortality, with larger dots having a higher percentage of dead oysters in the samples and smaller dots having lower percentages. And so if we look at the statewide mean mortality for all data from years combined, what this really says is in any given sample, on average, 7% of the oysters that we will collect will be dead. And if we compare that to the Port Royal Sound, we see that there is a lower level of mortality overall in the Port Royal Sound compared to the statewide average. And we suspect that this is reflected by the ocean-dominated system that we've heard described in some of the earlier presentations, with perhaps oysters in this system being less susceptible to salinity fluctuations that can cause mortality. If we conduct a similar process for size, we really see that oysters are fairly similar in size in the Port Royal Sound compared to the statewide average. And this is the average within our samples collected within fall and winter. In terms of new directions, this past summer, researchers at our lab started to conduct new disease sampling. And We should be clear here, we're talking about diseases in terms of things that make oysters sick, not that make people sick. And the reason that we started this new oyster disease research was really because we recognized that disease is an important driver or a factor that can contribute to overall mortality. There are a couple of different diseases that we're looking at. These are the two primary diseases that infect oysters in our region. Those are the disease of dermo, caused by a pathogen called Kingsley-Smith morinus. And in this particular slide, you can see that the infected cells are stained blue-black with iodine. So this is a visual method of assessing the level or the intensity of infection in a particular sample. The second disease that we look at requires histology to determine disease status and therefore is somewhat more time consuming. This is a disease called MSX, derived from when it was not identified to species level and was referred to as a Microsporidium species unknown. It has since been identified as Haplosporidium nelsoni. And we're continuing to gather data on these two diseases to try to describe temporal and spatial patterns of disease in our state. Switching gears now from sort of ecologically driven restoration, we can take some time to examine the importance of Port Royal Sound to our oyster fisheries. This particular map shows the boundary of a number of different DNR managed shellfish grounds, namely the state grounds shown in orange, which are the commercially harvested grounds. The recreational grounds shown in pink, which are recreationally harvested and not open to commercial harvest. And then lastly, in black, we have these culture permit areas, which are exclusively permitted to individuals that have exclusive harvesting rights within those areas. So in terms of an overview, Port Royal Sound accounts for about 37% of the total DNR shellfish management areas by area, more than 145,000 acres. 22 of the state's 82 state shellfish grounds, those commercial grounds, occur within Port Royal Sound. 44 of the 112 culture permit areas occur in this region. And in terms of landing, on an annual basis from 2004 to 2020, Port Royal Sound state shellfish grounds accounted for anywhere between 18 to 56% of the annual harvest by weight. The total harvest during this time frame from Port Royal Sound state shellfish grounds was more than 11 million pounds, which accounted for 40% of the total landings in this period. So in terms of take-home messages, Port Royal Sound clearly supports a significant proportion of the state's oyster populations. And this is important not only in terms of important ecosystem services, but also the economic benefits derived from our state-managed fisheries. Port Royal Sound is characterized by strong oceanic influence, as we've seen in this talk, as well as in earlier talks this morning, compared to other watersheds which seem to have greater land-based influences on salinity, which in turn have impacts on oyster demographics. And certainly these oyster demographics seem to differ by region based on the surrounding environmental conditions. And this is true in terms of mortality patterns I've described to you today. And we hope to explore more of these patterns of disease in future work. It's also worth pointing out that while oysters receive a lot of attention, there are other important shellfish resources within Port Royal Sound, such as rib mussels and hard clams, which are comparatively less studied, but likely contribute important ecosystem services to this region. With that, I'd like to thank you again for your time today and for the opportunity to talk to you about some of our important shellfish resources within Port Royal Sound. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Peter. That was really great talk, and you can see why the better understanding the oyster populations in Port Royal Sound so critical for all different aspects of better understanding the environmental processes that are present and acting in Port Royal Sound. One of the questions that I have is that in terms of, you had a great natural experiment with the huge rainfall event in 2015. With Port Royal Sound, what would it take to start mapping oyster beds further inland? I think find out if our oyster beds are moving further inland, given sea level impacts.
That's an interesting question. I would say that we're fairly comprehensive in terms of conducting mapping and flight areas within the area that is sort of within this critical zone, and which is within sort of DHEC's regulatory authority at our coast. And so one thing that we don't tend to see in South Carolina compared to some other states that have lower tidal ranges, we don't really see a lot of like low to mesohaline regions upriver where we see oyster populations, because there is so much sort of saltwater intrusion as a result of our tides. So it's a little bit difficult to picture what those habitats might look like in the short term. I wouldn't say that we're limiting our mapping efforts to sort of where oysters are specifically. I think we're capturing sort of the range of habitat, and I think most of those are overlapping right now, and I think it would probably be a long-term change in terms of the landscape before we saw oysters in places where we don't see them now.
Yeah. Okay. Question came up is, are you studying the possible effects of invasive species in Port Royal Sound on oyster populations? I don't know which invasive species we could be talking about, whether it's the green porcelain crabs, or are there any other invasive species you know about that might be affecting oysters?
Knowing that they're affecting oysters is sort of usually a second part of the research study. What we try to do on the front end is to really create sort of communication networks with as many stakeholders as we can to learn early about the occurrence of sort of new invasive species, or to better understand the distribution of invasive species. And so we are currently actively working in that area. We work very closely with the U.S. Geological Survey that manage a database for non-indigenous aquatic species, both in the marine and the estuarine environment. I will also say that our group is now very recently starting to conduct some research to try and get a better understanding of the family of portunid crabs, which are the swimming crabs. Obviously, blue crabs are very important for a number of ecological and economic reasons, but there are other species of Callinictes that do occur within the state of South Carolina. And Dr. Michael Kendrick, my close colleague here at the Institute, and his crustacean research group are starting to improve our understanding of sort of the distribution and the temporal spatial patterns of some of those other species of Callinictes, some of which could be considered invasive or at least non-indigenous, in terms of we don't really have a very good handle on what their geographic ranges are. So just as an example, that's one area that we're starting to sort of get some better understanding, and that would certainly leverage some of the work that we do in Port Royal Sound. We would be making use of our sort of long-term crustacean survey in the spring and fall that samples all the way from Charleston down to Calabogie Sound. So there would be numerous sampling stations within Port Royal Sound that would give us the opportunity to look at that. But we always have our eyes open for things that are unusual.
That's right. Great. How complicated is it for waterfront property owners to establish their own new oyster habitats using the technique that you demonstrated in your talk?
More straightforward than it used to be. How about that for an answer? As some of you probably know, DHEC recently passed new state-level regulations in support of living shorelines, and so prior to that, there wasn't a good regulatory pathway at the state level. It was like it didn't fall under sort of erosion control structure regulations, and so usually those applications were processed with an individual permit. For those of you that have dealt with individual permits, as opposed to something that has a clear path, they usually take a little bit longer. So in May of last year, DHEC, working with DNR, was able to pass these new regulations. So really, I would say if folks are interested in the potential for living shoreline, they should sort of reach out to DHEC OCRM and get a conversation going. From DNR's perspective, we're now working with Clemson to develop a marine contractor training course that will hopefully be rolled out this summer and fall, so that there are sort of certified contractors in place that will be trained and knowledgeable about how to install these living shorelines in a sort of responsible and effective manner. So that's sort of the next big step for us, I think, in terms of moving forward to make it more available to a greater community of users. And there is a new website that's up on Clemson's website that is sort of like Living Shorelines 101. So it's a good resource for folks that want to learn more about sort of creating living shorelines in front of their property.
Okay. Thank you, Peter, very much.